So last time we were going through the Apocrypha books. These are the 7 books plus the additions to Daniel and Esther that a good number of people hold to as scripture today. So we got to 1st and 2nd Maccabees. This was written, these 2 books are written sometime in the 1st century BC. We don't have an exact date, but somewhere in there. And these are probably the most useful books as far as us today, because these are histories. These tells us what happened to the Jews, at least a portion of the intertestamental period. So 1st Maccabees covers the period of 170 to 134 BC. After that, we have 2nd Maccabees written, but it covers the period before, so about 180 to 160, so a little bit of overlap there. Now, 1st Maccabees is written in Hebrew, 2nd Maccabees is written in Greek. Being written in Greek, the Jews of the 1st century would not have held to it as scripture, and 1st Maccabees several times says that in this time period, there was no prophet in Israel. 1st Maccabees 9, since the time a prophet had last appeared among them. Or there was such a great distress in Israel, such has not been since the last time a prophet had appeared among them. Or they stored the stones in a convenient place on the temple hill until a prophet should come to tell what to do with them. Or the Jews and their priests have resolved that Simon should be their leader and high priest forever until a trustworthy prophet should arise. And so we see during the time period that was in between the Old Testament and the New Testament, the Jews at that period as well knew that God was no longer speaking to Israel. This was a time where there was no prophet. And next we have the Wisdom of Solomon. This is unique as far as the time period because it may have been written after the time of Christ. It was composed in Greek, and the author says he was a king of Israel, and based upon the type of book and some hints in the book, it seems that he is trying to write as if he is Solomon. The first part, the first 5 chapters, is contrasting the fate of the righteous and the wicked, so very, very much like Ecclesiastes. And then it covers the nature of wisdom, and then wisdom through history. And so it's a wisdom book. Now, we know this was not written during the time of Solomon. For one, it was composed in Greek. But 2, it covers contests, athletic contests that did not exist at the time of Solomon, that only existed again after the Greeks came in because it was a very Hellenistic, a very Greek cultural thing. Now, some will try to say that the Wisdom of Solomon was removed by the Jews because it points to Jesus. They'll say that the wisdom described, and here the personification of wisdom, is Jesus. So when it says wisdom is a reflection of eternal light, a spotless mirror of the working of God, that does kind of sound like Christ. Yet, other places it says, for wisdom is a kindly spirit, but it will not free blasphemers from the guilt of their words. So if this is Jesus that is the personification of wisdom, then then he can't forgive people of sins. But if it's not Jesus, then it makes sense. So there is nothing in this that points to Jesus as being wisdom because of this verse right here, Wisdom 1, 6, and 7. It also has some teachings in there that are not consistent with the rest of Scripture. In Wisdom 8, 19, and 20, it says, as a child, I was naturally gifted, and a good soul fell to my lot. Or rather, being good, I entered into an undefiled body. So if you have a good spirit before you're born, then you're going to have good health. And that is not what the Bible teaches. And now we finally come to the additions. So this is Esther here. Esther, the additions anyway, were written about the 1st century BC, and this is because of these 2 names right here, Ptolemy and Cleopatra. Who here has heard of either one of those names before? No. So these 2 people existed in the 1st century. Cleopatra, of course, involved with Rome, Caesar, Mark Antony, all that. And Ptolemy was a ruler. Now, again, this was not written in Hebrew. And the main thing about this is there's a number of differences between Esther and the additions of Esther. We mentioned last time that the attitude of Esther towards the king, towards her husband, is completely different. So in the actual book of Esther, in chapter 2 here, we see that Esther is thought of well. She seems to be treating people okay, kindly, just kind of content and like a nice person. In chapter 14, this is Esther speaking. And thou knowest that I hate the glory of the wicked, and abhor the bed of the uncircumcised, and of every stranger. Thou knowest my necessity, that I abominate the sign of my pride and glory, which is upon my head in the days of my public appearance, and detest it as a minstrel rag, and wear it not in the days of my silence. Pretty strong language about the bed of the uncircumcised here, about her husband. And so you can see that there is a major difference there. There's also a undoing of the irrevocable edict. So in Esther, in chapters 1 and 8, it's a main part of the events, is that after a law is set forth by the king, it cannot be undone. This is how the Persians just ruled. This was unique to them as far as I'm aware. But in chapter 16, in the additions, we see, wherefore know ye that those letters which he sent in our name are void and of no effect. So the king's edict is void, which could not be the case. Will you click on the slide for me, Scott? Perfect, thank you. Now, this is a minor one, but still notable that instead of the Jews keeping Purim, all Persians as well are to keep Purim. And Mordecai and Esther does not initially receive a reward for exposing the plot of the two eunuchs to assassinate the king. Now, in the additions, he's actually given a position and presence initially, and then later on gets more for some reason. So again, it contradicts previous, actual Esther. Further, Haman didn't like Mordecai, not because Mordecai did not bow down to Haman and give him respect. It's because Mordecai exposed the assassination plot of the two eunuchs. That's why Haman didn't like him, at least in the additions. And in the additions, Haman is not an Agagite or an Amalekite. He is a Macedonian, completely separate group there. And then when Esther goes before the king, instead of the king looking upon her favorably and not killing her, in the additions, the king is at first very, very angry with her, so enraged that she kind of swoons a bit. Then he changes his mind. Now, most of these seem to be because of the problems that people had, or at least the Jews had, with Esther. The fact that she was married to a Gentile, and she didn't seem too upset by it. So they throw some of this in there. And so that seems to be why these were added. These could also be what are called midrashic additions. These are where the tradition of the Jews, basically their histories, were then placed alongside Scripture to give more understanding. We do the same thing with our Bibles today. Who here has like an archaeological Bible? This one? All right. Who here has anything that tells about what was going on in the time period to give understanding of the culture? Now, this is basically their version of that. But what happened is that when non-Jews and the Gentiles got a hold of these writings, they took it hook, line, and sinker, thinking that just because we have this and this together, then it must all be Scripture. And we'll be going into how this developed. Now, this seems to be especially the case with Daniel. So the additions to Daniel are written in the 1st or 2nd century BC. And specifically, these are not found in the manuscripts of the Dead Sea Scrolls. So the Dead Sea Scrolls show that they just had basic Daniel, no additions whatsoever. Again, the additions were written in Greek, and this is especially clear because this is poetry. One of the additions is the prayer of Azariah and the Song of the Three Young Men. Being poetry, being a song, there are play on words and constructions that is obvious in the Greek that would not make sense at all in the Hebrew. Other two additions, it's basically 3 different stories. One is the story of Susanna. This is where 2 elders of the Jews falsely accuse a virtuous woman of adultery. Daniel then comes in, figures out what's going on, spares her from death. And then there is Bel and the dragon. Bel being a deity of Persia here, or Babylon here, and then the dragon being an actual dragon that the Babylonians worshipped. So Daniel then shows that these are just foolishness things. Now this is known even by Jerome in AD 400. So 400 years after Christ, it is still known that these are not part of Daniel. So Jerome, he is the one who translated the Latin Vulgate. He was very keen on going back to the original Greek for the New Testament and the original Hebrew/Aramaic for the Old Testament. In his preface of the book of Daniel, he says, Daniel, as it stands in the Hebrew text, has neither the history of Susanna, nor the hymn of the 3 children, nor the fables of Bel and the dragon, which we, considering that they are now dispersed over the whole world, subjoined with an obelisk prefixed, as it were, striking them through, lest the ignorant think they had cut a great portion of the volume. So he's basically saying that all over the world, Daniel has the editions. But he, knowing that they are not part of the Hebrew, did not remove them lest people have issues with it. So instead, he marks it with an obelisk and puts this preface there so that people can understand that. At this time in church history, there is basically a big turmoil about this very issue, and we're going to be going into how this issue occurs. But even 400 years later, we can still see that those who wanted to know could see that there was a difference between these. So in summary, based upon the reasoning of the 1st and 2nd century AD Jews and Josephus, we can see that they would not have accepted these books. Now, again, we're not accepting their reasoning. We're accepting their results because Paul in Romans 3 approved of their results. He doesn't say yea or nay as far as the reasoning goes. So it doesn't matter why they didn't accept them, only that they didn't accept them. So in summary, we see a bunch of negative evidence, a bunch of evidence against these books. We see that they were not written in Hebrew. Baruch, Judith, 2nd Maccabees, Wisdom, and the editions of Daniel and Esther were not written in Hebrew. Therefore, they would not have accepted them. All of them, except potentially for Judith and Tobit, whose dates are unknown, were written in the wrong time period. Judith and Tobit may or may not, we just don't know. There are 2 books that specifically say they are not scripture, Sirach and 1st Maccabees. And there are numerous contradictions with history and scripture throughout all these. So there is a lot of evidence against them. Plus, there is no evidence of discussion of them being added or removed or even potentially added to scripture in the Jewish texts. They were very keen on recording this. But after going through all this time and last, the negative evidence isn't the important thing here. All this is just additional information. The most important thing here is that there is little to no positive evidence. We don't reject these books because of this negative evidence. All that does is raise the level of the positive evidence to accept them. But these books have no writer that performs miracles or prophecy. We have no prophet or apostle that attests these books as scripture. No one approved by God saying these books are scripture. And we have contradictions. These books are not in agreement with other scripture. This is the important information here. This is the important thing, is that not that there is negative evidence against them, but we have no affirming evidence for these books. And so it doesn't matter if they take away all the negative evidence we just covered, we have no affirming evidence for these books. These books are no different than any other historical document because they don't have these 3 things. And all the negative evidence is doing is meaning that we have to have a greater evidence of positive evidence, a greater amount of positive evidence to overcome, and which we clearly do not. So these books, as any way which we could tell, are not scripture, both because they lack the positive and there is a great amount of negative as a secondary issue. So any questions as far as these books and why they are not accepted as scripture? All right. So now we'll be spending the rest of the time going into how these books came to be accepted by some as scriptural. How did this actually occur? So initially, even by the Jews, these books were thought of as useful. You might think of them similar to Pilgrim's Progress, some C.S. Lewis books, anything that can be helpful to get you thinking and might have some ideas that can enlighten you, but not scripture. Over the centuries, these books began to be accounted as inspired and not just useful. Unfortunately, with any tradition, if you hold too closely to it for too long of a time, it begins to be accounted as God-given. And we can see this transition in canon lists and other historical data. So now we're going to be going over the Christian evidences. And the first one, oddly enough, is actually a pseudepigrapha. This is a false gospel called the Gospel of Thomas, written in AD 150 to 200. We'll be going over this specifically when we cover the pseudepigrapha, but for now we're just going to be covering one piece of evidence in it. But it is the first non-Jewish reference to the Hebrew canon. And we're using it not because it is a false gospel or anything like that. We're using it because it is a historical document. To sell any lie, you have to have some truth in it. Otherwise, people won't believe it. And this is a collection of sayings. It's basically one saying, another saying. It's not a historical account as far as events. And in line, or verse 52 of the Gospel of Thomas, it says, 24 prophets have spoken in Israel, and they all speak of you. This is one of the apostles supposedly talking about Christ. And so this is a reference of the Jewish scriptures, the 24 books of the Old Testament. And this is the first reference to it. So here very early we see that 24 books is still counted. Next we have the Brionius list. It is a manuscript from 1056, so a bit later in time, but they date it earlier because of the contents. It has the Didache, the two epistles of Clement, and the canon list. These are some early Christian writings. They are basically a handbook and then 2 letters of 2 different Clements. It's not the same Clement, but they can be useful to see what's going on in this history. But it has a list of Greek and Hebrew names of the Old Testament. This here you can see is a portion of the Didache from this work, I believe. So it only includes the titles. It lists Jeremiah, but we don't know as far as if Baruch will be included or not, since it's just the title Jeremiah. It also has Esdras A and Esdras B. This is a side note, but we don't exactly know what it means by Esdras A or Esdras B. Unfortunately, without giving us some sort of context on the actual writing here, it could mean, and most likely means, Ezra and Nehemiah at this time, but it could be any of these works down here or others. It could be first Esdras, second Esdras, which is also called for Ezra, or third Esdras. It doesn't really affect us because none of these books are accounted as scriptural. First Esdras is a combination of Ezra and Nehemiah, a bit of Chronicles, and some Midrashic additions thrown in. Second Esdras, or for Ezra, is very similar to Ezra and Nehemiah, but has some post-Christian writings thrown in. Third Esdras is the least utilized, and I do not know that one. I have not read that one. But Esdras A could mean first Esdras, third Esdras, depending on if it is Latin or not. It could mean second Esdras if it's in the Eastern European Bibles. Esdras B could be Ezra and Nehemiah combined. First Esdras could be third Esdras in the Vulgate, or Ezra in the Vulgate, or Esdras A in the Greek. And as you can see, it depends on the time, place, and other things as far as what these titles mean. So in short, we don't know. But I want to make sure I list that just so that you don't get worried about it. For now, it is just a tangent. So most likely Ezra and Nehemiah, or some derivative of that. And last, we cannot be certain of the additions to Daniel or Esther because this is just a list. Unfortunately, a list of titles does little, but you can still see none of the other Apocrypha books listed. And based upon the timing, since we only see 24, you might lean towards that, but we can't say for sure. Next, we have Melito of Sardis. We mentioned him before. He's the one that journeyed to Israel to report back to his fellow bishop Onesimus, not the Onesimus of the Bible, about what the Old Testament was. So he's going from Turkey to Israel, to Jerusalem. We don't know if he went to the Jews or the Christians, but he comes back with basically the same canon list as ours, minus Esther. Again, this is the time period where the Jews were having a discussion, and he seems to land on the opposite side of the Jews as far as the discussion goes. This might be because in this time period, we begin to see in the historical writings a strong dislike, to say the least, of the Jews, and this continues for a few centuries. Now, he only lists one Esdras, so this is likely Ezra and Nehemiah combined in one, since he goes from Jerusalem, where those books were combined. And he says specifically of Solomon, Proverbs, which is also wisdom. Now, some will try to say, look, it says wisdom there. You can see clearly from the context, and that is all the context we get from this, that is just another name for Proverbs. But some will try to say, oh, look, it's the wisdom of Solomon. It's just another name for Proverbs at this time. And now we come to Origen of Alexandria. This is a name that you may want to try and remember. He is about AD 220. And he is initially a Greek philosopher and a textual scholar. He then becomes a Christian, and he wrote a great number of books. His biggest one is called the Hexapla. It is the first interlinear Bible. You can see basically what would have been a picture of it. There's not many pieces of it remaining. But each column would be either a different language or a different translation. We'll get more into this when we cover this kind of material. But for now, just know he had a lot of textual scholarship, but he is a Gentile. He had a commentary on the Psalms, and he discusses the number of Old Testament books as 22, and he lists those books out. In his writing, Ruth is combined with Judges. We have Esdras 1 and 2. We don't know exactly, again, what that means. He does list the letter of Jeremiah. So this is the first mention of any of the apocryphal books. This would be chapter 6 of Baruch, but he doesn't actually list Baruch. This is most likely because he believes that this was truly from Jeremiah. Again, he is not a Jew, so he doesn't have a great understanding of the Jewish traditions. And he specifically lists the book of Maccabees as outside these. So this is specifically listed as not scripture in AD 220. Now, specifically as far as Origen, he gives us more insight as far as the book of Daniel. There is a man named Africanus who writes to Origen about the status of Susanna in the canon. Susanna is the addition to Daniel about the woman being accused of adultery. Now, this is Africanus speaking. Above all these, this pericope, this section, text, referencing Susanna, together with the other two, at the end of the book of Daniel, does not circulate in the textual form of Daniel received from the Jews. So Africanus is writing to Origen, and they're having a discussion as far as, are these truly scripture or are they not? Origen responds by acknowledging that, yes, the Jews don't hold to that, but this is what God gave us. So therefore, we must use it. I hope you can see the error in that. 2, he says it's edifying for the truth. Again, how does it being useful trump if it is really scripture or not? I hope you can see the problems with these two arguments. And he then writes very long and a lot about how bad the Jews are about everything. You can't trust the Jews, basically, is what he's saying. And so he holds to this. Yet we can see now from the Dead Sea Scrolls that you can trust the Jews because even before the time of Christ, they still had everything that they had afterwards. But here we begin to see the big discussion of, do we take what we have received or do we try to find out the truth of the matter? And Origen decides to take what he has received and doesn't want to go into the truth of the matter. Primarily, it seems, because the Jews have the truth and you can't trust the Jews. So any questions so far on these 4 pieces of information, these 4 evidences? Okay. So in summary of the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century AD, we see no acceptance of any of the apocryphal books as scripture, except the editions of Daniel by some, specifically Origen, knowing that it was not in the Hebrew, knowing that it was not original, and the letter of Jeremy, but not the full book of Baruch, again because it has Jeremiah's name on it. And we only have one area of uncertainty, and that is with the book of Ezra. What does that mean? We don't know, but in general it seems to be Ezra, Nehemiah, though it could be one of these. So that is the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century. We don't have a lot of information, but we don't really see much acceptance of any of the Apocrypha here, except for these here listed. Now we're going to go into the 4th century. The first piece of evidence is something called Codex Claromontanus. Codex just means basically a book. Now, we're not using the codex itself. We're using 4 pages listed between Hebrews and Philemon. This is a different scribe that wrote it. For some reason, we have a list between these 2 books in the New Testament. And this is something called a stichometry. This is basically an index or a bill, a receipt. So the scribe would count the number of lines for each book to make sure that 1, the purchaser got what he wanted, and 2, that he got to charge exactly what he did. Make sure that he doesn't get shortchanged or charged too much. So this is not a canon list. This is a manuscript. Like I said, this is basically an index. So being a manuscript, we cannot say that all the books listed here are scripture. We only say that people thought they were useful. Now this is the same as our modern Old Testament, except for some reason they didn't include Chronicles. We don't know why. Might be a copyist error, might be because they didn't have a good manuscript to copy from. Maybe they didn't have enough money. We don't know. Now, it may or may not include the additions to Daniel, Esther, or the additions of Baruch, but it does include Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, 1st, 2nd, and 4th Maccabees, Judith, and Tobit. And this might be kind of concerning. What? These books are already in a Bible, already in a codex? But I hope you notice there is a 4 Maccabees there. There is not one group that I'm aware of, any major group anyway, that holds this book as being scriptural. Yet if you use the argument that because they are included with known scripture, that they have to be scripture, then somebody has to accept that book, which no one really does. So these are just books that are thought of useful. But it does point out how useful these books were. People really thought highly of these books. So finally, in the 4th century, we actually see these books with scripture, but not necessarily counted as scripture. And we'll go into more as why they're not. Next, we're going to be skipping forward a few decades to AD 350s. This is Athanasius of Alexandria. He became a bishop in 320. He's in Alexandria, Egypt. He had 5 separate periods of exile due to conflict with Eusebius of Nicomedia. There is a lot of turmoil going on in this time period. A lot of exiles, a lot of excommunications, some executions, a lot of executions. And so this is a questionable period. And there's a lot of shakeup going on. This is where a lot of false doctrines enter in the 4th century. But he produced an extensive corpus, a lot of writings, and he cites Susanna, one of the editions of Daniel, as scripture in his writings. So now here, again in the 4th century, we see Susanna, one of the editions of Daniel, counted as scripture. But as far as his actual canon lists, in his Festal letter 39, he includes Baruch and the letter of Jeremiah with Jeremiah. So these are thought of to be from Jeremiah and thought of as scripture. For some reason, he omits Esther. We're also seeing a revival of the questioning of Esther during this time period, at least in portions of the empire. He does cite Tobit as scripture in other places, but he does not include it in his canon list. So here we see the first 2-tiered kind of categorization of scripture. We have full scripture, and we have diet scripture. We have full scripture and scripture light. So while he quotes it as scripture in other places, he does not include it as equal to the rest of the Old Testament. And this does bring into question, was he quoting Susanna as full scripture or as only as kind of scripture? But he does list these books as books to be read. Wisdom of Solomon, Sirach, Esther, Judith, and Tobit. So he doesn't say Esther's bad, he just, for some reason, demoted it. But again, we can see that these books here are thought of as well. Next, we come to Cyril of Jerusalem, about the same time period, but a bit over to the east in Jerusalem here. In his canon list, he lists 1st and 2nd Esdras. Again, we don't know exactly what he means by these books. Esther is not included, so we don't see Esther being accepted in the south or the east for some reason. Baruch and the Epistle of Jeremy is listed. And we have Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach not included, but yet he cites them as scripture in his other works. So we have more of the Apocrypha fitting into this 2-tiered system. Next, we have Hilary of Poitiers. That is a French name. I probably mispronounced that. I apologize. I partially apologize. It's French. But this Hilary is not a girl Hilary. This is a boy Hilary. Hilary is a boy's name this time. So this is a little bit later, but you can see here where this was from. He was exiled to Phrygia for being what is called pro-Arian. This is not an Arian people group. This is another tumult that arose in this time. Again, a very confrontational time period. But he connected the Old Testament canon to the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet. Now, he does say that Wisdom of Solomon was written by a prophet, but he does exclude it from his list. He says the Epistle of Jeremiah is mentioned, the Epistle of Jeremiah is mentioned, but he does lack mention of Baruch. So he may accept the epistle, but doesn't seem to accept Baruch. And he mentions that Tobit and Judith is accepted by some. So here we see that they now seem to be accepted as full scripture. So this is the first time any Apocrypha book is accepted as authoritative scripture. But he does list 22. So we see in the northwest that the original is being held to right now. We see Esther's being held to right now. But we do see some buildup of Tobit and Judith being accepted as full scripture, at least by some. Seems to be a minority opinion at this time, at least in the northwest. Next, we have Gregory of Nazianzus. How are we going to pronounce that? So in his book, he lists 22 books. He has the first book of Ezra there, the most likely Ezra and Nehemiah, since there's only one. Esther, again, is omitted. So he is in Turkey. He's in the southeast. And he lists 22 books, so he separates Ruth to get his 22 count. So the number 22 is still held in some regard, even in the southeast. Baruch is included with Jeremiah, but for some reason, chapter 6, the epistle is not mentioned. So we see a lot of kind of popcorning here. We see some people accepting this, some people accepting that. So there's a lot of discussion as to what is truly scripture at this time, at least as far as the Old Testament goes. He does not list the apocryphal books, but he does cite them in his writings. Again, the 2-tiered system took really strong hold in the south and the east. And next we have Epiphanius of Salamis, a little bit later in AD 392. So we're getting to the end of the 4th century. And he has 4 separate canon lists in his writings. He is from Cyprus, but he went to Egypt and Israel, so he travels around. He lists the 22 books, though he numbers them as 27 for some reason. And he specifically mentions that while he counts Baruch in the Epistle of Jeremy, he makes note that the Jews do not. The Jews only connect Lamentations to Jeremiah. So there is, again, some disagreement between what the Christians at this time thought and what the Jews thought. But that the Jews lie is still become pretty common. Unfortunately, from the 2nd century, for the next few centuries, the Jews are lying, the Jews are wrong, the Jews falsified things, is a pretty common argument. But that's not an argument today because we have the Dead Sea Scrolls, which we'll go into in a later lesson, Lord willing. He does have 1st and 2nd Esdras, and has Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach listed as disputed but useful. So that means some people hold these books as scripture. So we have Tobit and Judith. Now we have Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach being held by some. And now we get to what is called the Breviarium Hipponensis. This is a book containing the laws, the church laws, drafted at what is called the Synod of Hippo. So Hippo, down here next to Carthage, so in the south. This is a grouping of bishops, of deacons, of clergy, of people involved with any kind of church from a large number of places. They're coming together. And Augustine of Hippo comes along. This is what some people call St. Augustine. He is far from that, though. He initially was a Gnostic. He then came to Christianity and decided that there was a lot of things that needed to change about it. He introduced himself a lot of false doctrines. But he soon became a bishop, though for this gathering he was just a priest. He was a fast-rising star and had a far-reaching effect on churches. He had his enemies banished, excommunicated, and even put to death. But in this book about the Synod of Hippo, it lists the 5 books of Solomon. He includes Wisdom of Solomon and Sirach with those. It lists 1st and 2nd Esdras. This time period, it might be 1st Ezra and 4 Ezra that is mentioned here, that is referenced here. We don't know for sure, though. It does have 1st and 2nd Maccabees as scriptural, Tobit and Judith. And we don't know for sure, but considering that this was in the south, likely the additions to Jeremiah, the Baruch and letter of Jeremy, Esther, and Daniel additions as well. So this is the first time that all the Apocrypha are listed as full scripture in one place. 8393. So into the 4th century, almost the 5th century, is the first time that we see all these books in one place as scripture. Now, this is the time period where this discussion really hits ahead. And the 2 main people leading it are Jerome, which we mentioned before, and Augustine. Both are fine. It's however you like to float it. But this is 390 to 400. Now, Jerome was translated in the Latin Vulgate, so he was translating the Hebrew and the Greek into the lingua franca of the day, the Latin. And he promoted the original text, the Hebrew canon. Augustine, now the bishop of Hippo, he promoted a canon of books accepted and used by the church. Augustine could not read Hebrew. Augustine could only read Greek. And because he had a lot of things to introduce, he was very popular and seems to just want to use whatever is useful, while Jerome holds to the original since he was an actual Hebrew scholar. He wanted to translate from the original Old Testament and New Testament from the original languages. And he wrote prologues, as we saw before, giving the reasons why he made certain choices. Now, he didn't make all the right choices, but he made one major choice, and that was to use the original languages. And he held to what we hold to today as far as the Old Testament books. And he has no support for the additions to Daniel, Esther, or Jeremiah. So none of the Apocrypha are promoted by Jerome here. Augustine, though, he promotes the full Apocrypha. And this is where the discussion ends for the next millennia. Augustine, rising star, seems to put his stamp on most churches at this time, most lists, most writings, promote these books going forward, but not all. So this is how they became to be viewed as scripture. Over 400 years from the time of Christ, you see them being helpful with the Jews, being taken in by people who don't know the history, the tradition with these writings, and then because they are useful and they hold to them tightly, over the course of a few generations, they begin to be accepted as the same as Scripture because they are included with Scripture. This is a very strong lesson to us as far as making sure we hold tightly to what is scriptural and hold loosely to tradition. So, we went over a lot of material. That is not all the material that we could go over. We went over, I think, a single manuscript, a few comments, and a number of canon lists. There were some others that I had prepared, but they didn't really give us any new information. They kind of repeated a few things. But a lot of canon lists you'll get out there don't have a good manuscript tradition, meaning that over here it says one thing, over here it says something completely different. So we don't know what the original text said for those manuscripts. Therefore, we can't use them to understand what the people of that time period thought. So you might find somebody saying, look, here, using the apostolic canon, that's one very common one that has a very poor manuscript tradition. We don't know exactly what that said at all. They might say, look, this one supported it, but if you look at it from a few miles away, you'll find one that says something completely different. And again, manuscripts do not show us the canon status, only the use. In the 3rd century, we begin to see them being included in manuscripts. We begin to see them being used. In the 4th century, we see a 2-tiered system of scripture. And finally, in the late 4th century, early 5th century, we begin to see them being used, finally, as full scripture. And this discussion continued as far as Jerome versus Augustine, apocryphal books versus original Old Testament, until the Council of Trent in the 1500s. In the 1500s, this is when the Reformation is going on, and the reformers are wanting to go back to the original text. The Latin Vulgate at this time has a very high view. It is basically a holy translation. And they say, look, no, let's go back to the original text. Let's make sure we know exactly for sure what God said to us. We want to be as sure as possible. The Catholic groups, not liking this, then go the opposite way. They say, if you don't accept everything about this translation, even the number of books included, you're anathema, you're accursed, you're outside. And then the reformers say, wait a minute, if you're doing that, I'm going to do this. Those books are bad books. You shouldn't read those books. And so that's basically where it's been for the last few hundred years. Yes?
A couple slides back, you mentioned the idea of St. Augustine's side.
Mm-hmm.
Those were, I probably have the wrong word, maybe not accepted by the church, but somehow we had the word church there.
Yes.
My question is, and you did make a second statement related to churches. My question is it the idea of church by way of different faiths, i.e. Catholic or Jewish or other Eastern faiths and religions? Is that what you mean by church in that slide, as opposed to church by way of the gospel?
Not by church of the way of the gospel.
Which I presume
Yes.
not.
Yeah.
Okay, I did, but I just wanted to be clarified.
Thank you for allowing me to clarify. Yes, so when I mention church here, that is in the historical context because these people wrote as far as the church. So whenever I'm using it, it's always in the way that they would use it, meaning everybody that they see, not as what is truly the church. At this time period, I'm certain there were some true Christians, but we don't know. We can't talk with them. We can't discuss with them, are they truly Christians? But there are a lot of false teachings in this time period. Augustine, for example, he is the one that thought up with the idea of original sin. Babies were doomed to hell, basically. And we see a lot of others. We see the rise of the doctrine of Mary being basically akin to Christ as far as pure, unable to sin, sinless. We see a number of false teachings. And so at this time period, I doubt that most of the well-spoken ones were truly Christians, at least ones that we have writings from. There are a few books. If you're interested in that, I can at least tell you somebody that you can go online. I think his name is Aaron Gallagher. He does mention this in some of his stuff, but honestly, I cannot tell you which videos that he references some of the books that you can go into. But he is a member of the Church of Christ, and he loves this kind of history stuff as well. So if you're interested in getting a little bit more information as far as what was going on in history, check him out on YouTube and whatnot. Any other questions or comments?
So I think when we're talking about Jerome and we're talking about Augustine, we're talking about the Roman Church.
Yes.
Or the Catholic Church.
It wouldn't be Catholic as we know it today. It is not fully developed into that. For example, no pope. It's a bishop of Rome. He was one of 5, I believe. I cannot recall the other places. I want to say one was, I'm not even going to tell you because I'll probably tell you wrong. But there were 5 major cities at this place that, at this point in time, that there was a major bishop, and he had control of a certain area. Underneath them, there was single bishops of smaller areas, and then finally a single bishop over each church. As we saw before, when Melito was going to Jerusalem, he's writing to his fellow bishop, meaning that there were multiple bishops, there were multiple elders. Bishop and elder, same thing, at least originally. And so that's another thing that has changed, is the hierarchy. Later on, here another century or two, we then begin to see the first pope. And then they go back and say, oh, look, all these were popes. But they weren't called popes in their own time period. They were called the Bishop of Rome. And Augustine, he was so powerful, he actually went against the Bishop of Rome, who was a very powerful individual. And he got to have his way, even though he was just a lowly local bishop, basically. That's how popular he was. He was a very well-spoken, a very dangerous man to go against. Was there any other, okay. All right, any other questions or comments before we go to the last little section? All right. So today, we cannot get the same arguments that all these writers used. We no longer have the, well, they no longer have the argument that we should use the Apocrypha because the Jews changed things. We have the Dead Sea Scrolls now, that doesn't work. So they use that the Catholic Church accepted and closed the canon. So because the Catholic Church closed it, we can be confident that the Apocrypha are part of the Old Testament canon, or at least that's what they say. Yet, it requires the authority for a body of people that are not given in Scripture. We don't have anybody of the Council of Trent that actually closed the canon, because it did not get closed until the 1500s, at least as far as the Old Testament by the Catholic Church. At that time period, no one at that time period, no one in that council performed miracles, spoke prophecy, was confirmed by the power of God. And we also see that, again, we found copies of these, oh, no, sorry, back up a second. So they didn't try to say that because we found copies of these books among the Dead Sea Scrolls, so they tried to turn the Dead Sea Scrolls for their favor. Because they found copies of these books there, then they must have been accepted as Scripture by the Jews. But remember, just because they had copies of the book did not mean they thought it was Scriptural. There was many, many, many non-scriptural books that they had. They did not write any commentaries on these books. They did not cite these books as Scripture. So we have, again, no evidence that these books were thought of as scriptural by the Dead Sea Scroll community. And the Dead Sea Scrolls show that the Jews did not change anything really of note. We'll go over the Dead Sea Scrolls specifically in a later lecture. And last, they try to say that because it is in the Septuagint manuscripts, and the apostles primarily used the Septuagint when quoting Scripture, therefore, it was accepted by the apostles, and we should accept them today, the Apocrypha included, despite the apostles not actually quoting the Apocrypha. This is a very involved issue, and thankfully, Matt is scheduled to go over the Septuagint at a later date. So, in short, they try to use the Septuagint as a single work, as a single translation, basically akin to saying it's like the King James Version. It's not. The Septuagint is a combination of many different translations of many different books. It was not a full translation of the entire Old Testament. It was a translation of this book, another translation of this book by a different person, translation of that book by a third person, translation of this book by a fourth person, and so on. Many different translations, many different ways, many different times. And so there is no Septuagint. It's basically like saying the English Bible. Many different English Bibles. This is just basically saying the old Greek translation. Matt's going to go into this a little bit more at a later date. But, well, any questions on these modern arguments for using the Apocrypha? Hopefully you can see by going through the history that we went through so far that this doesn't hold up water as far as the history. This, at a later date, we'll definitely go through in detail so you can see that the Dead Sea Scrolls are very consistent with what we have as far as the Hebrew text, and very little changed over millennia, and that over the previous lessons where we showed what was truly accepted, what was truly a positive evidence for Scripture, the Dead Sea Scrolls lacks that for the Apocrypha. And the Septuagint, again, Matt will be going over at a later date. So in summary, this is the information we covered over the last 2 lessons. Any last minute questions before we end? All right, I'm not seeing anything. If you have any questions, see me. Otherwise, thank you.